series I'm calling God People or Just Good People. And session 1 is God's plan. Last week's reflections focused on the journey of the Hebrew people through the desert, how God was teaching them how to be his people. The journey took 40 years, and it was a time for a whole new generation to grow up. And they had been brought up learning God's way. And so eventually they were ready to enter the promised land, the land that God had promised their ancestor Abraham. Now these were God's people, and he was to settle them in their own land. If they were his chosen people, why did he settle them in a land that didn't have a great deal of farming land? It was a dry and fairly difficult place to live. Why didn't he settle them in the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which was lovely fertile land and that could have become a mighty nation? Well, the reason being God did not want them to be a mighty nation like all the other large ones. He wanted them to be a different nation, one that stood out from the others. But he was also very strategic, because it was no use putting his people, whom he wanted to stand out, in a place that was tucked away in some far corner of the world. He placed them right at the centre. And so I'm going to show you a map to see what we mean. So here's a map to help some people who don't hold maps in their heads. This is the Mediterranean, of course, Italy, Greece, Turkey. What we're looking at is Egypt down here. So this is where they were in slavery. And then over here you've got the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers and the area between, which is a very fertile area. So even though Egypt lost their labour force, they remained a big nation and a powerful nation. And then here you had, at different times, you had the Assyrians, Babylonians and the Persians all in this area. And so little Israel is between these large nations. So this one is a close-up map of Israel. And don't worry about the other side, there's 2 maps there. But you can see here how it's mountainous up one side, and the other side, the only low-lying land is along the coast and down the valley of the Jordan River. Now, to get through from one like Egypt to Mesopotamia, there were 2 routes. They could either go up the coast or they could come up this way. So they're the only 2 routes through. If you wanted to go between the 2, you had to cross through Israel. So Israel was a very strategic place for the trading routes. Now, God's placement was absolutely strategic. The nation he'd called to live differently from all the others were not a powerful one, but they couldn't be ignored. Their role was to show who God was to the rest of the world. Their role was to influence the rest of the world. Unfortunately, they didn't fulfill this role completely. The tribe of Dan was given the area where the Philistines lived, but they didn't ever conquer that. They preferred to live in the hills to the east. And this, of course, led to trouble further down the track because the Philistines were always troubling them. Further north, there were many victories over Canaanite towns, but not all. And the people there allowed the Canaanites to remain living in their towns. And this meant that the area they were supposed to control and influence the world through let other groups live there. And that watered down their influence, especially when they found the gods of the Canaanites and the Philistines perhaps more attractive than God, and they started to worship them. And so they turned away from God, and they didn't influence the world in the way they were supposed to. If we're to be God's people, we need to be different to the point where people say, "What makes you tick?" God doesn't want us to just blend in with the world. We are to be in the world, but not of the world. And if we are of the world, we can't influence it for God. So I guess the question is, are we willing to stand out to be different?
You have called us out of darkest night into your glorious light, that we may sing the wonders of the risen Christ. May our every breath retell the grace that broke into our strife. your blessing comes, that we may praise the